Some were treated.
Right, some were treated.
Now, the conclusions that you drew concerning those 6 fragments inside the cap, were those based on your comparison of them with the known hair standard given you from the defendant?
That's correct.
Do you know how long those 6 fragments could have been on that ski cap?
No, I have no idea.
Do a person's hair characteristics change over time?
Yes, they do.
In what way?
Well, in many ways, depending on what they do to their hair, what type of environment they're exposed to, how much sunlight they get, if they treat their hair. There's just a lot of different things that could happen to hair besides the natural effects of age also.
Okay, so you cannot tell us at this time whether those 6 fragments found inside the cap could have been hairs deposited by the defendant 5, 6, 7 years ago.
Speculation.
No, as I said, there's no way to say how long those hairs have been in that location on that item.
Is it uncommon in your experience, sir, in examining clothing to find hairs that are not consistent with the hairs of the owner or wearer of that clothing?
Objection calls for speculation.
It's not uncommon. I mean, it's not uncommon to find hairs on one's clothing that's submitted for examination that do not exhibit the same characteristics as that person's hairs.
And that's because?
Well, that's why I look at the stuff in the first place. If 2 people had physical contact, I look at the clothing to see if there's anything on the clothing of one individual, say the victim, that doesn't look like the victim's hairs. And if it doesn't look like the victim's hairs, then who could it be from? Possibly a suspect? Possibly. And that's why I do it.
Now, the only hairs on that cap that did not match the known sample of the defendant is the fragments, the 6 fragments that you described.
That's right.
And all the naturally shed hairs with roots from that cap were consistent with those hairs from the defendant.
They were.
Did you also ask for known hair samples from African American police and lab personnel in order to compare their hairs to those fragments that you found of black origin inside the ski cap?
I did.
And that was, were those hairs depicted on the Elimination Standards board we saw earlier?
Yes, they were.
It's 478. Can you please point out to us, sir, on this board, which of the photographs depict hairs of the African American lab and crime scene police personnel?
Sandra Claiborne, Jean Braggs, Claudine Radcliffe, Don Thompson. I believe those were the individuals.
Thank you, sir. And for the record, he was gesturing to the photographs that bear those names on People's 478, Your Honor.
Yes.
And none of the individuals that you've described whose samples are depicted by a photograph on this board had hair that was consistent with the 6 fragments you found inside the ski cap?
No, the hairs that were recovered from the knit hat could not have originated from these individuals.
Now, sir, did you find... let me get- hold on a second. Sir, did you find any Caucasian head hairs collected from that blue knit ski cap that were inconsistent with the known hair standards of Ronald Goldman and Nicole Brown?
There were two hairs that were recovered from my Q15, which was from the outside of the hat, which was a dyed head hair fragment exhibiting Caucasian characteristics, and from Q19, which was again from the outside of the cap. There was a light brown Caucasian head hair, which was broken at the proximal end. It had treatment on the hair at the distal end. It was about 3 inches long, and it was not like the victim's.
Now, with respect to all of the hair evidence that we are discussing today, sir, that was recovered from the evidence in this case, can you tell us when the hairs that you compared were deposited on those items of evidence?
You're asking about all the hairs?
In general. In general, for example, let me ask you this, to make it a little easier. The hairs recovered from the blue knit ski cap. Can you tell us when any of those hairs were deposited on that item?
No, I cannot.
And with respect to the hairs found on the Rockingham and Bundy gloves, can you tell us when those hairs that you compared to the known hair standards in this case were deposited on those items of evidence?
There's no way to look at the hairs and make that determination. However, from a persistence standpoint, it would indicate that they had not been there long.
And what do you mean by a persistent standpoint, sir? And
Well-
why do you draw a distinction between those gloves and the knit cap?
Well, with regards to a knit cap, it's something that may accumulate hairs over time. And a pair of gloves, the surface of the gloves is not conducive to retaining hairs for any length of time, so that they would tend to lose hairs very easily unless there might be some blood or some other material that's present on the surface of the gloves to cause the hairs to stick or to adhere. So some items would more likely lose hairs and it wouldn't keep them very long. Some items tend to hold on to hairs a little bit longer, such as a knit hat would tend to hold on to things longer.
Now, with respect to the hairs that you looked at on the Rockingham and Bundy gloves, did any of them have a bloody appearance to you?
I'd have to check on that to be sure.
Why don't we come back to that?
Okay.
Or would you rather check now?
Well, if you can wait, I'll check.
I'll wait.
On, shall I speak when I find the hairs?
Yes.
Thank you. All right, on Q1, which was the Rockingham glove, there was blood on the surface of the hair, apparent blood present on the surface of the hair that were consistent with Nicole Brown Simpson. That was the only thing reflected in the notes.
Thank you, sir. All right, now, getting back to those 12 hairs on the blue knit cap that you indicated exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant. Did you have photographs taken of some of the hairs, a representative sampling of the hairs from that ski cap that you determined were consistent with those of the known standard of the defendant?
Most of the individual hairs were photographed, I believe, except for one of the hairs that I removed from the knit hat myself. So there should be about 12 pictures.
All right, those people's 480,
480?
480.
Thank you. All right, so you indicated earlier that some of the hairs that you found to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant came from inside the hat, and some came from outside the hat?
That's correct.
If you would, sir, please indicate on each of the photos, now in 480, being shown to the jury, which of those hairs was found inside and which was found outside.
Q8A, which is on the lower left-hand portion of the chart, was from the inside. All of these first 4 pictures on the bottom on 8C, I'm not sure where 8C came from, inside or outside. It was unclear.
Because
There was no indication to me. It may have been from the bag, so there's no way to know. And that's the photograph on the lower right-hand portion of the exhibit.
So Q8A, and for the record, Your Honor, we're referring to the bottom row of
Yes.
photographs, so labeled.
Thank you.
Okay, so for Q8A, those were all inside?
Right, there were 4 head hairs, and 2 of these were naturally shed.
What can you tell us about the appearance of those 4 hairs, sir, Q8A, found inside the knit ski cap?
Well, there was some range, as you can plainly see, from a much coarser hair, again, pointing out that one-sided pigmentation that I mentioned previously.
And with respect to the hair, let me describe the position on the photograph, on the diagram. It's the photograph pointed to by Mr. Deedrick at this point was the 4th photograph from the left, bottom row.
And also we had some of the finer hairs that were represented in the known standard of the defendant were found in this particular item, Q8A, which would be the first 3 photographs on the lower portion of the chart.
And could you tell us, sir, did any of those hairs, of those 4 hairs in Q8A have roots?
2 of them did. There were 2 naturally shed hairs off of Q8A.
Did any of those hairs have a bloody appearance?
Could I refer to my notes? Yes, there was indication of possible blood on the surface of the 2 hairs that indicated that they had fallen out naturally. Q8A.
And when you say indicated they had fallen out naturally, were those the ones that had roots?
They're the ones that had roots, right.
Now, Q8C, which is also depicted as the last photograph as you face from left to right, was that hair recovered from the bag containing the hat?
That was, yes, from the bag.
And was that a hair with a root or a hair fragment?
That was a fragment.
if you could, sir, please describe, are there any other characteristics that you have not pointed out that you'd like to point out to the jury that caused you to come to the conclusion that the defendant's hairs exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those recovered from the blue knit cap?
Well, I've gone over a little bit of the process involved in trying to determine if a question hair originated from an individual. And one of the ways to do that when you have multiple hairs is to look at the range of the question hairs and see if the same range is exhibited by the known hairs. And if you can look at the known hair samples that were photographed on the upper portion of the chart, I chose hairs that exhibited a similar appearance as to the characteristics that hair exhibited. Whether it was coarse and dark with one-sided pigmentation, whether it was lighter with one-sided pigmentation, or if it was fine and exhibited the same coloration and diameter and internal characteristics. And again, we're looking at just a very small portion of both question hair and known hair.
When you say we're looking at just a small portion, you mean that's what the jury is seeing right now? You saw more?
Well, the comparison that I do involves the entire hair. And I chose a portion of the hair to demonstrate the association.
All right. Thank you, sir. Would it be all right, Your Honor, if we showed the board to the corners of the jury, because I don't think they're getting as good a view? Thank you.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
One, Your Honor.
People's 41.
All right, Mr. Deedrick, if you wouldn't mind stepping down to explain to the jury what's depicted in these photographs. You indicated, I think we've seen some of the hairs recovered from the inside of the cap, which you determined to be consistent with those of the defendant. And what do these photographs depict?
Well, these are additional hairs taken from Q10 on the lower left, Q13, which is the second photograph on the bottom, Q14, third photograph, Q18, and Q47.
Can you tell us, sir, which of these photographs depict hairs recovered from the inside of the knit cap?
Well, Q47 came from the inside, which was one of the hairs that I removed. I'm sorry, what was the first number down there?
Q10,
Q10 was from the interior. Q13 was from the interior. Q14 was from the interior. Q18 was from the exterior.
all right. Q23,
Well, Q23 came from Ronald Goldman's shirt.
all right, so of the hairs from the blue knit cap, Q10, 13, and 14 and Q47 were all hairs recovered from the inside of the knit cap that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant.
That's correct.
And Q18 was from the exterior of the knit cap.
That's right.
Can you describe for us, sir, You said you recovered Q47 yourself?
There were 2 hairs from Q47, and I photographed one of the hairs.
We see that one that you photographed here on the board.
That's right.
Those 2 hairs that you found that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant that you labeled Q47. Can you describe where they were in the hat when you found them?
Well, they were actually part of the fabric. After turning the hat inside out and looking at the hat very closely under magnification, I had to actually pull the hairs out from the yarns. It happens sometimes if the hairs have been in there for a period of time that they tend to become actually part of the fabric. Very difficult to see because the hat was dark.
And what kind of hairs were they? Were they fragments, hairs, forcibly removed? Describe.
They were naturally shed hairs.
Which means that
They had a root,
both of them?
both of them.
So how many hairs total that you found to exhibit the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant were found inside the knit cap?
Okay, from the inside of the knit cap, there were 4 hairs off of Q8A, 1 from Q10, that's 5, Q13 makes 6, Q14 makes 7, there were 7.
What about Q47?
I'm sorry, 8, 9, you're right, apologize.
Okay. Q8C that we indicated came from the bag containing the cap. Could that have come from the inside?
It could have, I don't know where it came from.
So 9, possibly 10 hairs found inside the knit cap exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those hairs of the defendant.
That's right.
What about on the outside of the knit cap?
Well, on the outside, there was a full-length hair with a root, which was Q8B1, and also Q18.
Can you describe for us, sir, the condition of those 2 hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant that you found on the outside of the knit cap?
Well, the one on Q18 was just a fragment. It was a portion of a hair, head hair, and on Q8B1, it had a root. It also had what appeared to be a little tag on it.
What's a tag?
Well, a tag is a little extension of the root that is sometimes confused with follicular tissue. Follicular tissue is this part of the skin where the hair is actually attached. It's a harder substance. It just forms a little extension, and we call it tags.
Well, wouldn't the existence of that tag indicate that the hair had been pulled out?
Objection leading.
Sustained. Phrase the question.
With respect to whether or not the hair was forcibly removed or naturally shed, does that existence of that tag from the hair follicle have any significance in that determination?
No.
So the existence of that tag does not indicate necessarily that hair was forcibly removed or not?
Does not indicate that, no.
What does it indicate?
It indicates it has a tag.
All right, we talked before about the why don't you take a seat for a minute, sir, and I'll put this down.
Yes. All right.
We were talking earlier, I believe, about primary and secondary transfer. You recall that, sir?
I do.
Now, do you have an opinion, sir, concerning whether or not the hairs inside the blue knit cap that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant were deposited there by means of primary transfer, that is, wearing the cap, or secondary transfer, picking it up from somewhere else?
Object speculation.
Sustain.
Sir, does the existence of, in a general sense, does the presence of a number of hairs in a certain position on an item of clothing have significance to you with respect to whether or not it is the hairs got there by primary or secondary transfer?
Objection, speculation.
Overrule.
Well, on the inside of undershorts, I might think that that's probably a primary transfer.
Okay.
On the inside of a hat, I would also expect to see, logically, a primary transfer.
Then in that regard, sir, with respect to the 9 or 10 hairs that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant inside the knit cap, do you have an opinion as to how those hairs got there by primary or secondary transfer?
Objection, speculation.
Overrule.
Because hats are worn on the head, as we all know, and in combining that with the transfer or loss of hair, it's certainly consistent and reasonable to believe that their presence indicates that they came from a wearer of the hat, yes.
Now, you indicated that you also found a hair on the shirt of Ron Goldman. Can we cut the feed, please, Your Honor? 43F. Do you know where on the shirt that that hair was recovered?
I do not.
Can you describe the hair that you found that was recovered from Ron Goldman's shirt?
It was a very short head hair fragment.
Was it suitable for comparison?
I thought so, yes.
And did you cause a photograph to be taken of that hair that was recovered from Ron Goldman's shirt?
I did, and it was part of the last exhibit.
I think you indicated before that it is so labeled. It's Q23.
That's correct.
Can you please point that out, sir?
I'll be glad to. The photograph on the lower right-hand portion of the chart, second from the right, are labeled as Q23 hair from Goldman's shirt. That's a photograph, again, about 250 times magnification of that hair.
Now, you indicated earlier there was an elimination standard board in which you indicated there was hair of African-American lab and crime scene police personnel whose hair was taken for purposes of comparison.
Right.
Did you compare their hairs to this Q23 hair found on Ron Goldman's shirt?
I compared all of the question hairs with all of the elimination hairs. It included Q23.
Head hair samples board was previously marked as People's
478.
478. Thank you, Ron. All right, now you compared then the hairs of Sandra Claiborne, Jean Braggs, and Claudine Ratcliffe and Don Thompson, as shown on that board, to the hair found on Ron Goldman's shirt, which you labeled on People's 481 Q23?
I did, yes.
And what was your opinion concerning whether or not any of their hairs were consistent with the Q23 hair found on Ron Goldman's shirt?
The question hair recovered from Ronald Goldman's shirt, Q23, could not have originated from these individuals,
And on what do you base that opinion, sir?
based upon a comparison of the microscopic characteristics that were exhibited by the known standards and the question hair.
Well, can you explain, sir, why you concluded that Sandra Claiborne's hair, as depicted on People's 478, could not have been the source of the Q23 hair on People's 481?
Well, besides the fact that the photographs look different, I didn't base it solely on this. I looked at the entire hair and the characteristics of the entire sample.
Are there
But it's
some
much darker. It's much darker in pigmentation, and it's quite a bit larger
larger?
in diameter. As-
Thicker?
Thicker than most of the hairs that I was seeing.
Is that a characteristic that you also compare, sir, thickness?
Yes, it is.
What about the hair of Jean Braggs? Does that look, can you explain to us why you ruled out Jean Braggs as a possible source of the hair found that you labeled a Q23?
Could I step down?
Please, I'm sorry.
Okay, with Jean Braggs, one of the characteristics I mentioned before was pigment clumping. You see a prominent pigment clumping or patching in a couple different areas. Also some streakiness of the tissue that's found in the very center of the hair. It's just an area that represented some of the characteristics that were present in the Jean Braggs head hair standard. But again, the comparison is not by photographs, it's an overall process. The curl of the hair, the buckling that appears in the hair shaft, the diameter or thickness of the hair, the appearance of the tip, the appearance of the root, all of these things are thrown into this comparison process besides this 250 magnification piece of the hair, which is quite small.
Did you have any further remarks to make about the distinctions you drew between Sandra Claiborne's hair and the Q23 hair?
Well, there is a little buckle here. I don't know if you saw that. There's a little indentation. With black individuals, the hair shaft may tend to twist on itself a little bit, and it's called buckling. It's just a characteristic that is found within that group of individuals. The one-sided pigmentation you don't quite see. It wasn't present on all of the defendant's hairs, but it was a prominent characteristic. But again, it did not exhibit the same characteristics as the defendant's hairs.
Or the Q23 hair?
Or Q23.
Now, you can have a seat for a moment, sir. All right, referring you back, sir, to People's Exhibit 475. It's an atlas of the photographs that you brought from the FBI depicting 16 different individuals of black origin. You indicated, sir, that you prepared this in order to demonstrate for us the variation that you can find.
That's correct.
Well, it would appear that the lower, let me see if I can count it down. At the bottom row, as I face it from left to right, it would appear that the third one to the right looks just like the photographs that you prepared of the known samples of the defendant and the photographs of the evidence, some of the evidence hairs that were recovered from the blue knit cap.
Objection leading.
Overruled.
Well, it is a hair from the defendant. I included that in the exhibit.
Okay, can you please point out to the jury the hair exactly that you're referring to and that I've referred to?
Yeah, the hair on the lower right-hand portion, third hair, photograph from the left-hand side. That was a known sample of hair from the defendant's hair sample.
Thanks.
What was our exhibit number on that, Ms. Clark?
475, Your Honor.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, Your Honor. The 16 individuals board was 464. We now show this board, Your Honor.
All right, thank you, gentlemen.
May I? Now, sir, is your finding, if I may reveal the results on the results board pertaining to the defendant. Is your finding, sir, of a head hair that exhibits the same microscopic characteristics as those found in the defendant's hair, would you say that that was consistent with the defendant having had some physical contact with Ronald Goldman?
I object. That's speculation.
Sustained. It's a vague question.
You earlier spoke to us about primary, secondary transfer of hairs. When individuals have contact through a violent struggle, have you, in your past experience, found the hairs of the attacker on the clothing of the victim?
Objection. Past, irrelevant past experience, speculation.
Overruled.
Yes, I have. That's why I look at clothing from victims of crime.
And is your finding of a head hair consistent with the hairs of those of the defendant on Ronald Goldman's shirt, consistent with the defendant having attacked Ronald Goldman on the night of June the 12th?
Object. Speculation.
Sustained.
Is it consistent with the defendant having had contact with Ronald Goldman?
Same objection.
Sustained.
Is the finding of a head hair on the shirt of Ronald Goldman consistent with those hairs of the defendant, consistent with a primary transfer from the head
Objection.
Overruled.
of the defendant to the shirt of Ronald Goldman?
Probably more so towards secondary type transfer as opposed to primary.
Please explain.
Well, a primary transfer would best be demonstrated by hair that's been forcibly removed that has a root that indicates it may have come out during a struggle. That's probably the best way to do that, to make that determination. A hair fragment, on the other hand, would more likely be found on the exterior clothing of an individual and to have been transferred in that way. That would be more, what I would think would be more likely explanation as a secondary transfer as opposed to primary.
And you indicated to us earlier, sir, that it's very common to find the hairs of a person on his own clothing.
It's very common, yes.
Then would the finding of the hair fragment that exhibited the same microscopic characteristics as those of the defendant on Ron Goldman's shirt be consistent with the defendant having grabbed Ron Goldman from behind, wrapping his left arm around him in an effort to stab him with the right hand, in which his clothing would come into contact with the shirt of Ronald Goldman?
Objection, speculation.
Sustain.
All right, would you expect to find hairs from an attacker on clothing of the victim if there was no bodily physical contact between them?
Object and ask for sidebar.
Overruled.
I wouldn't expect to find anything if there was no physical contact. It's possible that hairs may be blown off of clothing, but it's more reasonable to believe that the actual physical contact results in the transfer, especially of hairs.
Thank you.
All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, before we take our recess for the day, I just wanted to take this opportunity to call to your attention Miss Jennifer Fitzpatrick, who is back in the back there. She's been our operator of our whiz-bang, what we call the whiz-bang system. This is our fancy media system. And as you know, so far this trial, in over 5 months or 6 months, we've only had one foul-up, and that was when the power died, and that wasn't her fault. And she is going to be returning to her law firm of Deutsch, Kerrigan, and Stiles in the Big Easy. She's from New Orleans, and she'll be returning there. And Ms. Fitzpatrick, I want on behalf of the parties in the court, thank you for your service. All right. All right, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Deedrick, you can step down. Ladies and gentlemen, please remember all my admonitions to you. Don't discuss the case amongst yourselves, form any opinions about the case, conduct any deliberations till the matter has been submitted to you. Don't get burned by any fireworks. Don't let anybody communicate with you. Have a nice holiday weekend. All right, we'll stand in recess. Council, I have some other matters to attend to Monday morning. We'll stand in recess until, Wednesday morning until 10:30. All right, thank you, Council.